All right, so I think I'll go ahead and do the introductions real quick, and then you can share screen and we can get going. I'll be trying to let people in too as they come. Anyway, welcome. Thank you everyone for coming here today to our summer, or at least in the Northern Hemisphere here, our summer edition of the Zoom Care Ethics lecture seminar series that we've been doing this year. Today, Eva Kittay will be talking about her excellent 2019 book, Learning from My Daughter, and Amber Knight will be giving the commentary. Before I jump in and provide you a little bit more in the way of introduction, let me share my screen for just a second to let you know what we have planned so far for the fall. Let's see. Here it is. Okay, you see that? Yeah, okay. So three events will continue. I mean, I know, or I hope we're moving out of the pandemic even more in the fall. But these Zoom lectures have been nice because it allows us to get together from across the world and think about and talk about care and care ethics things together. So the three events planned so far for the fall, and probably this will be it for the fall. More than three might be too much. Alana Butch, who works on medical anthropology and aging in care. We'll be talking about her book, Inequalities of Aging, on September 15th. Usually these are on Fridays at noon. Alana is going to be teaching on Friday, so that's one exception. Her event will be on a Wednesday, and then the other two events will be on Friday. Virginia Held on Friday, October 15th, and then Maurice Hamilton and his co-authors talking about, at this point, I think, forthcoming book, Care Ethics in the Age of Precarity, but by November it should be out. So they'll be talking about that book. So I haven't sent out any kind of, or created any kind of registration or anything for those yet, but that'll be coming. For now, if you just want to maybe note those on your calendar or something, then just know that those are coming up. Okay, so to get to today's event, our speaker, Eva Kittay, needs really no introduction, especially among this crowd. She's a distinguished professor of philosophy at Stony Brook University, SUNY, and has long been a leader in the fields of care ethics and disability studies. Among her many, many accomplishments, there are, I guess, just to name a few. She was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. She's been awarded an NEH Fellowship. She was awarded the Lebowitz Prize by Phi Beta Kappa and the American Philosophical Association for philosophical achievement and contribution, and has received many other accolades. She's the author of many books, including one of my favorites, Love's Labor, some 100 or so articles and book chapters on care, disability, and other topics, and is also the editor or co-editor of several other books on cognitive disability, care, and feminist philosophy. Today we'll be discussing her book, Learning from My Daughter, the Value and Care of Disabled Minds. Our discussant today is Amber Knight, an assistant professor of political science and public administration at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Professor Knight is the author of 10 published articles focusing mostly on disability, and is currently working on a book project with Joshua Miller, who I was just talking to. He's out there somewhere. There he is, okay. Tentatively titled, I guess this might be more than tentatively titled now, The Politics of Prenatal Genetic Testing, Reproductive Autonomy and Disability Justice, which touches upon a number of themes that Professor Kittay talks about in the book we'll be discussing today. So the format, Professor Kittay will start by giving a 15 to 20 minute summary of her book. Times are flexible here, so if you want to go a little bit over or under, no problem. She's going to particularly focus, I think, on chapter 8, which was made available to everyone. And then Amber Knight will provide something like 15 to 20 minutes of commentary and questions to get the discussion started. After that, we'll just open it up for discussion, questions, points that you want to make. And we'll just keep going until we run out. We're tentatively scheduled to close out around 1:30 today. On format as usual, if you have a question, please just go down to the chat function in the center at the bottom and just write, I have a question, and I'll just take the questions or comments in order. And then, if you have a small point, you can also just, kind of signal in some way, and we'll go to you. It's all pretty informal. Anyway, and if somehow I don't see you, then just bust in at some point. With that, I'm going to pass things over to Eva Kittay. Thank you for being here. Thanks for agreeing to present here.
Oh, well, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I've been really happy to be listening in and participating in your many wonderful seminars. So I know Chapter 8 was made available, but I wanted to sort of start with the cover of the book because it's particularly meaningful. I've got this text stuff happening on the bottom. I don't know how good it is. I'll leave it on, but if it's distracting, just let me know. I just wanted to point out this, my daughter's hand in mine. This is a way in which she very regularly connects, and she wants to connect to you. She takes your hand. She doesn't speak and is very limited in what she can do, but this is a very important part of her connection, making connections. And here is a picture of the lady. That's my daughter's Sasha. So I think of learning from my daughter as the second of a trilogy. I didn't quite realize the extent to which it really was a trilogy until I had done learning from my daughter. And the first book is Love's Labor. It's a second edition. That's why it covers a little different than you might have seen it in the past. And in Love's Labor, the third part of the trilogy is the one I'm working on right now, and it's tentatively called Who's Truly Human. The first part of this trilogy is Love's Labor, and together it with the next two volumes record and explore the ways in which living with a person who has very significant cognitive and physical disabilities has forced me to rethink very long-held philosophical verities. And these range from the question of equality to central moral and bioethical concerns, as well as questions of normalcy, well-being, justice, dignity, and personhood, that the last three I particularly take up in that last volume. In Love's Labor, I focused on women. Now, women is the first word of the three. And I asked whether women could play an equal role in social, economic, and political life without reconfiguring how society deals with the ineluctable fact of inevitable dependency, inevitable human dependency. But behind that question was my experience of living with a person who is as significantly disabled as my daughter and who has lifelong dependencies. She's dependent on care, has been all her life, and will continue to be. That experience brought clearly into view the way that the gendered and social organization of dependency care results in the unequal footing that women have when they enter into the public arena. And how the success of those who do often relies on the dependency work of a woman less well situated. Talking now about the gendered way in which dependency care work is done. And there I argued that equality itself was based on a vision of the human being as atomistic, only held together with others through voluntary agreements, whereas the reality was that our dependencies and interdependencies render this a totally artificial way of understanding human bonds. And it's only by recognizing our connectedness and our dependencies and interdependence and giving these a role in political as well as social and economic life will we ever realize the fruition of our moral parity. I speak of moral parity, which I take to be the heart of the notion of equality. I ended that book with a discussion of Sesha and hoped by doing so I could convey what the demands of our inevitable human dependency required of a meaningful equality and a just society. In learning from my daughter, and subsequent volume, I am very much more directly talking about the person who is the dependent in love's labor. And that part of the relationship comes front and center. The book is in three parts. The first, learning to become a humbler philosopher, speaks of the what I believe to be much dogma in philosophy. And that dogma is born from failure to acquaint ourselves with people with disabilities. Our epistemic gaps warrant a humbleness that is too often absent in philosophy. The first chapter then begins with the neglect or dismissal of concerns of disabled people within philosophy and with philosophy's fixation on reason. I also give a justification, of sorts at least, of the first person and autobiographical method that I adopt. The second chapter of that first part attacks directly the assumption of human typicality that we call normalcy, which is operative in social, political, economic life, and certainly in philosophy. I confront not only the assumption of normalcy, but I think more importantly, the desire for the normal. The assumption underlies theories of well-being and the good life. The desire is expressed in the way in which disability is stigmatized and includes matters such as prenatal diagnosis, altering the body in ways that conform to the norms of normalcy, and in the exclusion of persons who do not meet these norms. The stigma is most profound in the case of cognitive disabilities. I contend that in good measure, we desire the normal because what is desired or marked as desirable is what gets to be the normal. At the same time, I point out that no one really wants to be desired for their normalcy, but rather from their singularity. I didn't include a slide of my Valentine from hell, which is, please be my Valentine, you are so normal. No one wants to get that Valentine. So normalcy has a double edge to it. It's something we desire, and yet it's something we try to move beyond. So what I conclude from in this discussion is that normalcy, in the case of disability or other divergencies from the norm, what is singular about us, what is individual about us, not individualistic, but individual, the individual we are, is that individual is not seen against a background of a person's conformity to a norm, to the normal. And as a consequence, we see difference only as anomaly, not as a singularity. Normalcy then is but the backdrop for that which makes us special and desirable. Without feeling ourselves or what we possess, our properties, as desirable and acceptable to the community of which we are a member, the chances for a good life is greatly diminished. Thus, it looks very much as if normalcy is a requirement for a good life. It gives us a baseline for our expectations, for how we regulate our lives, and for demonstrating the singularity that each individual has. Yet when one lives with a disability, the disability just becomes normal. It's just a normal part of ourselves and a normal part of our lives. And what we are doing when we normalize our disability in this way is that we operate based on not based on any norms, but we operate on an expanded sense of normalcy, of what is normal for us. So when norms are fixed and rigid, there's little hope of accommodating and including difference. But if our norms are capacious, we can be open to different ways in which we can experience and operate in the world. Fixed norms, fixed notions of what is desirable is exclusive and oppressive to those who do not meet them. What we need is are capacious norms. Sorry, I'm losing my place here. What we need are capacious norms that will allow us to include many different understandings of normalcy, of what is the regular in our life that we then move on from. In the second part of the book, I look at this desire for the normal in the context of reproduction. Most people want a normal baby, and medicine wants to meet this desire. Thus, we have different forms of prenatal diagnosis, even pre-implantation choices that include selecting against disability. In the first part of Chapter 2, I explore the questions of reproductive choice by considering really how much control we do in fact have, and how the psychology of choice reveals that our decision-making is neither rational or fully rational, nor is it a really reliable means by which to arrive at that which we truly desire. Yet at the same time, I reject the idea that a woman who chooses to abort based on prenatal testing is necessarily sending the message that a disabled life is not worth living, or that a disabled life is a lesser life. And this has been called as the expressivity, expressivist objection to prenatal testing. So even though I argue against the expressivist objection, I also believe that the kind of justification for selective procedures that are put forward by many bioethicists is deeply problematic. Those arguments aim to establish that it is the duty of women to give birth to the best possible baby, generally within the scope of normalcy. There's an interesting exception to that. Some make this still stronger, that this obligation is a moral obligation. You're actually doing wrong if you carry to term a fetus that has been diagnosed as impaired. These arguments do trade on the idea that a disabled life is lesser, and quite explicitly so, even when they grant the possibility that one can live a good life without a disability. But that same life would be better without the disability. In the final portion, whatever that means, I mean, that's a very interesting hypothetical. What would your life be like? Would it be better? In the final portion of this part, I defend the right of women to make their own choices, imperfect though they be, in the absence of complete understanding of what mothering such a child is like. It would be good if we could fill in the epistemic gaps, but we're nowhere near that. The third part of the book is on care, the ethics of care in philosophy, disability, and ethics. In these chapters, I hope to elucidate what is distinctive about a moral theory that is either centered on care or amends a more traditional moral philosophy with the insights of the moral importance of care. Care is a very significant part of our moral life, both as moral agents and moral patients, and it's quite astonishing that philosophy has so completely lost sight of this central feature of our lives. The significance of care as a moral concept is rooted in feminist ethical theory, but its salience was particularly apparent to me in the many years of caring for a highly dependent person. Thus, I begin this section on care with a discussion of dependency. And in this chapter, I try to provide a much more thorough exploration of the question of human dependency than one would find in my previous work. I take on board the many concerns that people have about dependency and the fears about being dependent on another. I try to identify what aspects of dependence what aspects of dependence are harmful, and how to mitigate those bad aspects of dependency, which aspects of dependency are not harmful necessarily, and try to take a more full look at the dependency, in part to respond to the disability community's real dislike of the notion of dependency. I look to a notion of managed dependency, where one allows oneself to be dependent on another for some things, if that will permit one to more readily engage in those things one cares about more. The next two chapters are specifically on an ethics of care. And in the first of these, I reiterate the important features of an ethics of care, familiar to people who work in the area. But I also try to understand this ethic in light of the criticisms that have come from the disability community. And my hope, whether or not it's a futile hope, I'm not sure, is to articulate an ethics of care that partners with rather than stands in opposition to the work of disability theorists. I try to make the case that an ethic of care is better suited to the needs and aspirations of disabled people than other moral theories. Again, knowing full well that making this case is a great challenge. Finally, it's not the final chapter, the penultimate chapter, is the chapter on the completion of care. The philosophical point of these two chapters, actually, 7 and 8, but particularly 8, is to develop a notion of care that's genuinely normative rather than descriptive. This may be a very narrow aim, but one that I believe has very broad implications. For if we're trying to construct an ethics of care as one moral theory among many, or as a significant component of another moral theory, we need a concept of care that is fully normative in the way the concept of justice is normative. For example, we don't speak about bad justice, though we may question whether something that is supposedly just is in fact just. To be just is just something that is morally commendable. We speak of caring too much, or this care is poor. Care as a concept and as a term that we use in everyday life is enmeshed in caring practices, some of which are good, some of which are not so good. And therefore, care is more often descriptive than normative. But I ask, how might we distance this concept of care from practices which poorly realize the ideal of care? How can we isolate a conception of care that is fully normative, that is to say, care as it ought to be, even in the practices that we're talking about? The most significant move to help us see the ethical is to see the ethical achievement of care. It is to focus not on the intentions and motives of the caregiver, but on how care is received or taken up by the one cared for. A principal insight can be gleaned, and I apologize to those of you who've heard me talk about this before, but I'm going to use the same slide for it. For a thought experiment, we see a plant that is wilted. There's a pitcher sitting there, and we pour what we assume is water into the pitcher. Turns out to be vinegar. And of course, the plant dies. So the question is that care? And my answer, and I think the answer of most people, in fact, is that no, the plant has not been cared for. It hasn't been cared for. If treating it this way makes it die. So I think from this thought experiment, we see that we have a strong intuitive sense that a being's well-being must be positively impacted by our action if our actions are to count as care. At least, at the very least, it ought not to be negatively affected. And this I take to be sort of the core of that normative notion. So from this notion, there we are, a number of things follow. First of all, that caring is an action, or it's not yet caring. And this is because nothing can have the effect of care if it's not put into action. I want to call your attention to my use here of the small caps that I use. And I use this to distinguish this fully normative sense of care as opposed to our daily understanding of care, which, as the thought experiment is meant to show, actually does involve this normative core. So the second proposition that we can maintain from this thinking through this thought experiment is that care is an achievement, and to care is an achievement verb. Use that in the Gilbert-Ryle sense of the term achievement verb. And third, care requires that the object of care respond in some way that results in the achievement of care. That is, caring requires that the cared for takes up our actions as care. So care is not something we do to someone. It is something we do for another. Sorry, I have to. For another's benefit and with their engagement. There has to be an uptake on the part of the other if our action is to count as a benefit for the other. And if the other is not benefited, has not taken up our actions as a good, we fail to confirm the benefit that our efforts of care were directed at. So I lay out a few regulative ideals of care. The idea that care is to be completed in the other is itself a regulative ideal. It's not something that we can always accomplish. It's not something we can always accomplish at the time the care is given. And it may be something we can never fully realize. But it is the regulative ideal of care, which is also grounded in the flourishing, I want to say, of all parties, care and carer alike. And the reason for this is if we take care as a supreme good, right? It's a good not only for us, but it's a good for everyone else. So if our caring is such that it diminishes the flourishing of other parties, it's not, again, care in a fully normative sense. Care should be commensurate with, so thus care should be commensurate with the flourishing of others outside the caring relationship. And another regulative ideal is that care respects and aims to meet the genuine needs and legitimate wants of one who is permanently or temporarily, inevitably dependent. We have to respect the other's conception of the good in order for us to direct our actions to that person's flourishing, as that person understands their own flourishing. What is of value to that individual? But the idea of genuine wants also isn't entirely subjective. There is an objective set of criteria that I don't discuss here at all, but there are constraints. And legitimate wants, I use the term legitimate wants to indicate those wants that can be satisfied, because I think care is directed not only to meet needs, but also our wants. And sometimes our wants are more important than our needs. Our wants, but those wants, for them to be legitimate wants, are ones that have to be commensurate with the ability of others to satisfy their wants. And so that's those that are cared for should be able to receive without harming others. An important regulative ideal of care is that the good is the good as seen from the perspective of the cared for. And if you build that into your conception of the good, as I think we ought to, because I think that's what's at the heart of care, care is not opposed to respect. It's a different concept than respect, but it requires respect. It requires respect for the cared for. What the cared for cares about is essential for a fully normative notion of care. So these sorts of considerations lead me to ask a question that I think is not too often asked in the care literature. And that is whether there's a moral obligation to receive care. And my answer is that there is a moral obligation to receive care when it's offered in good faith, with the requisite competence, and that it's a delimited obligation. It's limited by the ability of the cared for to take on this obligation. And that care be taken up graciously. This term graciously has been a stumbling block, and because it suggests gratitude. It suggests that what I am saying is that one has to accept care with gratitude. Well, I mean, it's fine if you feel gratitude, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm thinking about is that some individuals will receive the care without acknowledging the carer's needs, will, they have a life, that they have responsibilities and so forth. It's the over-demander, the one who insists that their niece take care of them full-time, even though others can do so, and the niece has a family to take care of on her own. That kind of reception of care, I think, is not the meeting the moral obligation to receive care. So that's what I mean by receiving care graciously. And it's the problem with the failure to receive care when it's offered in good faith, with requisite competence and graciously, is that we refuse the relationship that care is, and the good of relationship, which is a good both for the carer and for the cared for, in a fully normative understanding of what care is. So the harm of refusal of care to the carer, it's different in the case of intimates and paid caregivers. In the case of intimates, there can be a rejection of love and concern. I don't know how many of you have experienced trying to take care of an elderly mother who's been a great caregiver all her life, but who certainly does not want to take your care. And the frustration and difficulty and harm and hurt that results from that. But it may also be that you're not the best caregiver for your mother in that case, and your responsibility might be to find someone who is better able to do that. The harm to the paid caregiver is that it impedes her it impedes her ability to fulfill her duty, which is the way in which a paid caregiver generally does engage in care. It's her duty to care for you. She takes that on. So there's the over-demander. I'm not going to go into all of this because I think Amber is going to want to talk about the over-demander, so I will leave that to her. And the last chapter of the book is a discussion of the Ashley X case. The Ashley X case is a case of a young disabled girl who was given massive hormones to try to keep her small because she would need care all of her life. And the doctors and parents agreed that one way, that the way they wanted to deal with that was to keep her small so they could keep her close. And they also did a hysterectomy and removed her breast buds for all had reasons. But the consequence is that you have this girl now who has been shrunk, not shrunk, but who has been kept the size of a small girl and has been physically kept very much as a girl and not allowed to mature into her womanhood. And I argue using the notion of an ethic of care, that as good as the intentions were of the parents, and I do believe the parents had the best of intentions, and the intentions of the doctors, I don't think this was care. I don't think that in the end we would see if Ashley could speak, if she could communicate, which she probably can't, but she may find some means of communication, as does my daughter. This might not be something that she's appreciated at all. And it also has to do with the kind of care she's going to get from others, for how others are going to see her and see the way in which her carers, the ones who are closest to her, saw her. I can tell you, it's not in my book because it happened after my book, but I can tell you that my own daughter, who is now 51, made it very clear to us that she doesn't want to be called a girl. She wants to be called a woman. And we do two hands. This is girl, this is woman. And sometimes she makes a choice, sometimes she doesn't feel like making a choice. Sometimes it's a kind of random action. But when I asked her this question, she had her hands folded and unfolded them and very deliberately went to the hand that said woman. So this is a person who would have very much the same kind of diagnosis as Ashley does. And we don't know what her mind is comprehending, that she doesn't function as more than doesn't have the functioning of more than someone who's a few months old, doesn't mean she doesn't have, that she remains at that level of understanding. So I argue that that's not a case of good care. That's not a case. Yeah, that's not a case of good care. I end the book with a meditation on my daughter's body, and thinking about how this individual who does not speak, who you have to get to know entirely through her bodily aspects, it gives me the very strong sensation of an inner self, of a soul, or of and I would want to say a good soul. And I sort of contemplate why I might think that, or how I might think about that. So that's the book. And Amber.
Great, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for this opportunity. I just want to start there, to be a part of this conversation about such a fantastic book, learning from my daughter, The Value and Care of Disabled Minds. I really can't wait to read the third volume of your trilogy.
Can't wait to write it.
I just experienced a lot of joy in reading it, and I wish we had more time to have this conversation. So in the book, let me just, you did a really great job summarizing it. Let me just say a few words of what I took away from it, and then I'll jump into my questions and my comments. So this book grapples with how and why philosophers should use the lived experience of disability and cognitive impairment in particular as a prism through which we can all, as philosophers, re-examine and challenge long-held views about the meaning of the good life, human flourishing, and of course, the place of reason and theories of moral and political personhood. And perhaps most importantly, this book continues the ongoing project that Eva has started of illustrating how the experience of cognitive disability throws a spotlight on the inevitable dependency that characterizes all human life. And she makes a very compelling case that the need to give and receive care should not be considered some sort of a tangential concern or outlier or afterthought in philosophical thinking. Instead, care should be considered a foundational aspect of social life that should take center stage in moral considerations about the just arrangement of human affairs. Right. So I like that you placed it as a trilogy because it's very consistent with Love's Labor. And as you explained, the book consists of 3 parts. The second part is my personal favorite, since it overlaps with much of my own personal work. But part 3 is where Kittay develops and applies her moral theory of care in light of her experiences caring for her daughter Sesha. And so today I'll focus my commentary primarily on this last section in the chapters therein. There are 2 overarching themes I want to address today, but before I do that, I want to begin by saying that I'm incredibly sympathetic to Kittay's project. I think that she's been a wonderful advocate and ally for the disability rights movement, and I've always been particularly grateful for her willingness to call out critical disability studies scholars who are physically impaired like myself, but who have ignored the fact that many of the core tenets of disability studies, including the social model of disability and the mantra, nothing about us without us, those core tenets may readily pertain to a person who is blind or who's missing a limb like myself, for example, but might not work so well, right, for an elderly person with dementia or a person of any age with profound cognitive impairment. And so I think she's really moved the discipline forward in important ways by making it more inclusive, but also enriching our analyses, right, of what we know. So as someone who's generally behind the thrust of the project, most of my feedback is pushing for further elaboration to make sure that the book can more fully realize some of its stated objectives. And the first theme I'd like to discuss has to do with the widespread concern in much disability studies scholarship that paternalism is part and parcel of care. And of course, Kittay's response and proposed remedy to this concern. The second theme I'd like to take up is I'd like to explore the idea that we might need to think a little more deeply about the differences between paid and unpaid care and the regulative ideals that should guide the provision and reception of different types of care labor. So with regard to the first theme, first, as Kittay readily acknowledges, many critical disability studies scholars and members of the disability rights movement are deeply suspicious of the concept of care. There's a general distaste for the term and its connotations, and this distaste or the suspicion stems from a widely shared concern that the notion of care is necessarily paternalistic and disrespectful to adult people with disabilities. And so I think Kittay does a nice job of trying to ease this tension between the ethics of care literature and some of the work in critical disability studies. And she tries to ask this question of how can we make an ethic of care accountable and relevant to people with disabilities? The goal is to develop an ethics of care that, in her words, meets the genuine needs and legitimate wants of people with disabilities in ways that preserve the dignity and equal personhood of all engaged in caring relationships. Right, and as she mentioned, this is kind of no easy task. So in chapter 8, Kittay reassures disability studies scholars that the notion of care she puts forward won't be turned into an instrument of paternalistic power by developing regulative ideals which are demanding, and I think perhaps rightfully so, and to a certain extent, for both caregivers and care recipients. So to begin, for their part, the carer must pursue the good of the cared for from the cared for's perspective and for their sake. That is, a good caregiver must care about the things that the cared for person cares about. As Kittay has argued elsewhere, a good caregiver disciplines herself to have what she calls a transparent self. That is, a self that is respectful of the perspective of the other and takes the other's own conception of her needs and wants into account. And of course, this isn't an easy task, largely due to epistemic barriers, especially in cases of cognitive impairment, when a person's communicative or verbal capacities might be impaired to the point where they can't articulate their own express needs and interests. Nevertheless, the ideal of respect is baked into Kittay's theory of care, and this emphasis on respect provides a safeguard against excessive paternalism in the caring relationship. It means that a caregiver can't impose their own idea of what is good for the cared for upon them without due consideration of what the cared for regards as their own good, or it won't count as care, right? It just won't count by her definition. And so I was left wondering if this qualification might potentially satisfy a skeptic like Anita Silvers, right? Although there's no way to know for sure since she's no longer with us and can't speak for herself. But Silvers once wrote, she said, quote, "Modeling social organization on being cared for and caring thus appears to make compliant behavior a mandate for persons with disabilities. For them, submissiveness remains the price of good treatment," end quote. Silver's point is important to consider since in a liberal society, providing care is technically voluntary. People are not required to care for others. And because the provision of care is technically voluntary, many people with disabilities have felt like beggars can't be choosers, right? But Kittay's insistence that a good caregiver must care about the things that the cared for person cares about might dispel this expectation that beggars can't be choosers. So I'm thinking that it does a lot of work there, good work there, that regulative ideal. But conversely, the cared for have obligations as well. Kittay argues to receive care graciously when offered in good faith and with competence, as much as their limitations allow. This point, I think, as I read it, is meant to underscore the agency of the cared for in the uptake of care. And this recognition of agency is refreshing, right? It matters since recipients of care, and particularly people with disabilities, have really frequently been typecast in the care literature as passive objects of the caring activity of others. At the same time, though, this regulative ideal muddies the waters for me. And I was left wondering, and you mentioned this a little bit more in your talk, I think, than in the book, right? What counts as the gracious uptake of care, right? You started to elaborate a bit more, but I think I'd like to hear a few more examples. Kittay, mostly in the book, provides a few examples in the negative, noting how her aging mother, unlike Sesha, fiercely resisted her care and was ungracious, and that's on page 186. And as I was racking my brain, I actually could more easily come up with examples of what I thought of as ungracious care, ungracious uptake. And in fact, paradoxically, most of the best caregivers in my life, my own fantastic mother included, are the biggest pains in the ass as recipients of care. They are resistant to having the tables turned and assuming the role of care recipient. But it still remained unclear to me what gracious uptake requires in practice, and I push this point because it returns us to the aforementioned quote by Silvers. How is the expectation of gracious uptake different from the expectation of some sort of compliance or submissiveness? I also asked this question after reading Judith Heuman's recent memoir that came out, which I think is fantastic and everyone should read it. I'm a big fangirl. And there's a part of her book where she talks about the freedom she felt while she was at camp. And there's a great documentary, Crip Camp, if you haven't seen it yet. And even though she in the book, in the memoir, she talks about her relationship with her parents as a wonderful, caring relationship. I'm going to read you a passage where she captures how exhausting it is to constantly have to feel grateful for care. She writes, quote, hang on just a second. She says, and this is on page 27 if you're interested in reading the book, camp was completely different. Camp was for us. Our participation wasn't contingent on someone else's generosity. It was a given. I didn't have to worry that if I wanted to do something or go someplace, I'd have to ask somebody for a favor. I didn't have to feel guilty about how much work it took to get me dressed or to take me to the bathroom. The counselors were paid to do these things for us, which made all the difference in the world. Because the reality is, asking people to do something for you or care for you when you're not paying them means that you're asking someone for a favor. Favors mean that someone has to stop what they're doing, whatever it is, in order to help you with what you're doing, which always feels like an interruption, an intrusion. At camp, I didn't have to worry about what I needed or how much help I could ask for at one time. I didn't have to secretly rank what I needed in order of importance so as not to ask for too much at once. I didn't have to feel that bad feeling. So as I interpret this passage, Judith is quite the gracious care recipient. The fact that she tries to ease her mother's caregiving labor by secretly ranking what she needs in order of importance so that she doesn't overwhelm her mom is very telling. She tries not to be too demanding. She tries to go with the flow, and she isn't resistant to care either. She doesn't act proud or obstinate, but she sure does find the whole thing exhausting. and the guilt of feeling like a burden is ever present, except for when she's at camp. So what might we make of Judy's experience? I'm not entirely sure, but perhaps one possibility is that there's just no way to get around some of these dynamics. So at one point, when discussing moral luck and instances when caregivers might not be sure of whether or not they did the right thing, Kittay writes, and this is on page 214, that, quote, nagging guilt may just be one of the occupational hazards of caregiving, end quote. But maybe this is also true of care recipients, especially individuals with permanent disabilities who are reliant on long-term care to go about their daily lives. But my concern is that feeling obligated to graciously receive care, even if graciousness isn't synonymous with gratitude or feeling gratitude, if there's some sort of obligation, might this exacerbate the problem of feeling indebted to others, right? Or guilty about having heightened care needs that you can't meet on your own. Then my second point is more related to chapter 6. Kittay criticizes individuals with disabilities who choose to have their caregivers made invisible as they provide assistance for activities of daily living. And she argues that the expectation that assistance should be invisible both overemphasizes the value of independence and also devalues the physical and emotional work that a caregiver does. Now, certainly, critical disability study scholars need to be far more attuned to and disturbed by the exploitation of personal care attendants and home health aides. This workforce, which is disproportionately comprised of immigrant women of color, is systematically underpaid, exploited, and mistreated. And on pages 158 to 160, there's the example of Bill, who has quadriplegia, and his personal care attendant, Joe. And it's the characterization of this relationship is, in fact, I think, upsetting. Bill seems to reduce Joe to some sort of a prosthesis or an assistive device of sorts. But I want to push back a little bit here and suggest that a paid caregiver's role might sometimes require blending into the background so that people with disabilities can go about their daily lives. This might be circumstantial. So I teach a disability theory and politics class, and once had a student with quadriplegia take the course, and she had a personal care attendant in the class who would help clean out the ventilator and give her sips of water and other kind of tasks of daily living. And the care attendant took great lengths to be as unobtrusive as possible, but it was clear that the two of them had a nice rapport. After class was finished, my student spoke highly of her personal care attendant in class when she would share personal reflections as they related to the course material. I would even say gush over her sometimes. And I'd watch the two of them chat and joke together after class was done. So from my perspective, clearly some measure of friendship or other regarding sentiment was there. And so while I think that personal care attendants should not be dehumanized, mistreated, or exploited, there may be times when I think it is morally acceptable to think about care as part of the service industry, and as such, consider the relationship as a working business-like relationship in certain contexts. I'd like to think that a person with a disability, like my student, can expect their personal care attendant to blend into the background in a work or a classroom setting, for example, without necessarily perpetuating an oppressive situation. So after the example of Bill and Joe, Kittay asks, quote, and this is on page 161, is it not better to recognize and to create conditions that foster relationships of dependency, replete with the effective bonds and a sense that each participant has received her due? Relationships which can transform otherwise unpleasant intimate tasks into times of trust and demonstrations of trustworthiness. The effective bonds and reciprocal emotional intimacy that Kittay envisions seems appropriate in familial and relationships and friendships, but I wonder whether this is unrealistic for a working relationship among adults. And so are paid caregiving relationships qualitatively different? Should they be governed by different regulative ideals and moral considerations? And many people with disabilities who employ personal care attendants would say yes. And it's precisely this difference that makes many prefer the language of consumer-directed personal assistance services or long-term supports and services over the vocabulary or the language of long-term care, since a working relationship is more of an egalitarian relationship. Care treats the cared for person as an object of benevolence, Assistance, by contrast, highlights the important principle that it is a disabled person whose projects and choices matter. The worker's there to assist her with realizing them. And the vocabulary of long-term supports and services can also lend itself to thinking about assistance as a social right that's owed to citizens, rather than a handout or a favor from a benevolent, caring person. So anyhow, I'll finish there, but I'd love to hear some of Eva's thoughts in response to some of these points.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Amber, that was great. Eva, do you want to respond to some of those comments? Do you want to take a break for a couple minutes?
No, I'm fine. No, if the people want to take a break, it's fine with me too, but I don't.
They can more easily take a break. Just step away for a moment. So I guess it might be nice to hear a couple minutes reply, and people, if other people have comments or questions, go ahead and put in the chat that you have a question or comment, and I'll start as soon as Eva's done. I'll go down the list and invite you in. Go ahead, Eva.
So I don't know if I could ever convince Anita Silvers. I never was able to convince Anita Silvers, but I don't know if she actually, we actually talked about my ongoing way of thinking about this. And of course, Anita's work was important in terms of my trying to fashion care that did not make the care recipient entirely be passive and the compliant. So this question of personal caregivers and the invisibility of the caregiver in that situation, or the assistant in that situation, it's a extremely interesting and important question, I think, for care, but also for our understanding of ourselves. I mean, we're operating in a world where, in order to be successful or be able to do what we want to accomplish or get some of the things that are important to us, we are supposed to be these independent, autonomous people. And it's interesting that after the experience at Camp Crip, which is a wonderful movie, Judith went on to found independent living centers, right? That's the term. But I'm also interested in this idea of exhaustion, that it was exhausting, to have to make her needs known to her mother, worrying at the same time that she's not over demanding. And I think I haven't taken that fully into account. Would it be that way if dependency were more accepted? No. If it were less stigmatized? If care wasn't as devalued as it is? I mean, we don't ask for our janitors to be in the classroom either, It is wonderful when someone can seamlessly answer to your needs, your real, genuine needs, not inflated needs. But here's what got me in the Rebus discussion. That article is written by a woman whose mother was a personal caregiver, and who she took the job of her mother for a while so her mother could go and take care of her own mother. And one of the things she says is it possible to be valued and invisible at the same time? And that's a serious question. But beyond that, and I don't know if it was in that piece or somewhere else, where asking about the satisfaction of the work done and the job done. One of the things that the disabled folks said when asked, did the person go over and above what she needed to do? And they said, no, she did exactly what she was supposed to do. The caregivers, on the other hand, always felt that they were often felt like they were going over and above. And what was a real dissonance there was the fact that there was no appreciation on the part of the cared for, the part of the person who's being cared for, of that effort of invisibility, and what it takes, to make yourself invisible like that. And so, is that a problem with the notion of care, or is it a problem with our notion of independence? Or is it a desire on the part of a person with a disability or a person with any kind of need, really, to want to have those needs seamlessly taken care of? This is really at the heart of what my difficulty is with, and I've tried to deal with some of it with the paternalism. I don't think that being cared for is being a beggar, but if you view it as being a beggar, you view it as being a beggar. So that's the best I can do with that answer. But thank you for bringing up. And I should read Judith Newman's autobiography. That's very important for this very discussion. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
By the way, the reason there are no positive cases of accepting care graciously is because it's a negative notion. When you don't receive it graciously, you can talk about what that looks like. But when you do, there's nothing to talk about. Right?
So we have a bunch of questions. Again, you can keep adding if you want to get in line. Just type you have a question in the chat. We'll start with Lisa Tessman.
Thanks. Hi, Eva.
Hi, Lisa.
You already know how much I love the book, and that it has led me to think a lot of things in terms of my own philosophical work, but also lots to think about just personally, apart from work. And I think my question today comes from that. So what I've been thinking about, because I entirely accept your notion of care as a success term, and I entirely accept the criteria, and particularly that it has to be subjectively taken up by the dependent, by the cared for. So having completely accepted that, I wonder whether we need, alongside all caps care, a different notion of care that would also be normative, but that would denote something like the value of attempted but failed care. Because it's not just descriptive. Namely, it's just descriptive if we say lots of people do that, they attempt and they fail. But if we say that there is value to attempted but failed care, then we are saying something normative, or at least evaluative. And in thinking that we need such a notion, it's because, well, for one thing, I think it matters why the care fails. It could fail due entirely to luck, to something entirely external to the agent who is trying to care. But it could also be to the limitations or shortcomings of the person who is trying to care.
Mhm.
And it could be their inability to enter the subjective perspective of the cared for, you know, and that's a real failure, you know.
Mhm.
The reason I say I want to give it some normative value is because, at least in my life, so
Mhm.
many important relationships I have to look at and say that what took place there was not care, you know, to the point where I have to say, if care is just a success term when it's normative,
Mhm.
I don't think my mother cared for me,
Mhm.
but she sure did attempt to.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
And my ambivalent feelings towards her can't be captured just by the normative all caps notion of care. I have to also, in order to explain those ambivalent feelings, acknowledge as valuable her attempts at care that failed. So I wonder what you think of having a second normative notion of care that is not a success term.
I think that's very good. I think that's a very good addition to the to what I'm trying to lay out here. Um, uh, there is, I mean, I wanted to make a very strong case, you know, to eliminate all the ways in which people kind of sidestep, you know, um, sidestep their failures to care, or think that, you know, having tried to care is just enough, you know. I think when you really are trying to care for someone and you don't succeed, you feel like you haven't cared for the person. You feel like you've tried to care for the person, but you haven't. You feel like you haven't cared for the person. Which is one reason there's so much guilt with being a caregiver. But I think you're right. I mean, I use the notion of not morally praiseworthy, but not morally blameworthy. And I think somewhere stuck in there that it may be praiseworthy from some other perspective, you know. But I think what you want to say is it should be viewed as praiseworthy from within an understanding of care, um, as something that is something that isn't a cop out. I mean, it really is a virtue to try to give the care as much as you fail to give the care. So, I mean, often if you fail to give the care, you have to look at why you failed to give the care and whether you're in the best position to do that. Unfortunately, the way we think about motherhood is that mothers always think that they have to be in the position and to do all that caring, and they often don't have the whatever it is that's needed, or the relationship is too fraught to make it possible. But I think it's a very reasonable suggestion that you're putting out there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. That's interesting. So who do we have next? Jenny Nadalski.
Hi, thank you so much. Sorry, I missed the beginning. I'm recovering from a COVID shot, which is going on forever. So I wanted to say a little bit about graciousness. I love that term. I've often thought about this. And so first of all, I want to say that I don't think it's true there's nothing to be said. When you're observing attentive care received with graciousness, there's something beautiful. It's like the word grace is at the base of this.
Yeah, you're right.
And I think it's important to try to capture that and teach that, that people learn from childhood on that receiving care with graciousness is one of the human skills we all need to acquire. It's not God-given, it's culturally fostered. But of course, and you've already hinted at this, I think all these questions about graciousness and about how we treat paid care workers is so embedded in the background cultural norms that at the moment it's almost impossible to get it right. The project has to be to change those norms. So my father, who lived to be 102 and received a lot of care in the last 10 years of his life, was an incredibly gracious care recipient. And I always thought it was because he thought he was entitled to it. He'd been cared for all his life. He didn't feel like a burden. He didn't worry about whether he was, this was how life was. It had changed a little bit in dimensions. Whereas it was much harder for my mother, although she was quite gracious too, and mostly failed in it with pain or fatigue, which is an important thing, right? It's very difficult to be gracious under some circumstances. But so I think if culturally we aspire to the norm that we all deeply understand ourselves as needing care all our lives, all the time, and that we are all capable of, to some degree, almost all of us, I'll say, of providing care. And that is a human obligation, that a whole lot of this shifts. But, that's going to take a generation to accomplish. And so just a last thing about, the invisibility of the care worker. I think this is all taking place against the backdrop of how we think we can treat workers of all kinds, right? We don't have to pay attention to their human needs and how they feel about their work. That's not what it means to be a worker. A worker is to perform their, whatever, making the widgets or making the bed, and so there's a background of indifference to workers that I think feeds into this and justifies it, even in this, quite intimate kind of relationship. And it doesnwe mean that there still aren't issues of privacy that play a role here. But I think, if we are able to really shift our understanding of independence and autonomy and the way those have been misunderstood as synonyms, then I think a lot of this would be aided. But I want to thank you so much, and I especially appreciate capacious norms. I'm hoping to make very few revisions to my final manuscript, but this will be one of them.
Thank you, Jenny. I entirely agree with you. I recognize, as I talk about in the book, I recognize the importance of the completion of care in the contrast between my daughter's acceptance of care and my mother's refusal of care. How can I say that's an example of graciousness, since, you think she doesn't do anything, but she's not resisting. She's not acting as if she's annoyed or angry at you. But then again, she has a particular syndrome that makes her a very nice person. So it's difficult to articulate what it means to be gracious in caring, in receiving care. In some ways, I think about it, an actor goes on stage, gets paid for what they do, but they expect applause. The applause it's not just gratitude, it's a kind of recognition of, what they have put out there. Because actors put out something of themselves out there. And that can't get compensated, by the payment. And it's that kind of understanding of the other, understanding that the other, and I think your case of, your student is maybe a perfect example. The fact that they could have that relationship, she could remain invisible in that context where she needed to be invisible. That might be, a real example of the kind of thing you want to see happen. So, Amber, maybe you want to say something about that.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
We're good. Okay, so we still have a bunch of questions. We'll go to Marco Aurelio dos Santos.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, especially Eva, for the.
Marco, you're very faint. Can you turn up your volume a little bit?
How isn't the maximum stereo on my phone? Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Let me get closer here. I'm sorry, I'm on my phone, unable to reach my computer. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, especially Eva, for the fantastic presentation. Very enlightening, very well, great points to discuss, to think about it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Amber, as well. Thank you for the great points you showed to us, summarizing about paternalism, the stigma of dependency. Thank you, Daniel, for organizing it. Great to be with you all, guys. I just present myself briefly because I'm kind of new and foreign here. My name is Marco. I'm originally from Brazil, but I'm a little up here in old Canada in Regina, Saskatchewan. And I'm currently pursuing a master's degree in philosophy. I'm interested a lot in the issues, the topics about disability, about care. Most specifically, I've been thinking lately about the notions of care and about the dignity, especially of people so consider with the cognitive disabilities. And so my supervisor sent me the link to participate in the talk today. So I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you very much. And my question goes, if in part has been touched already, not necessarily about the aspect of graciously, but I was wondering when you mentioned that the care need this care to be true needs the part of the willingness, the engagement of the person cared for. So I'm thinking, but what if when the person who's caring is willing to care for, but on the other hand, we may have anyone, regardless of the situation, may not be willing at the moment, may not be engaging in the care, and care is still necessary to be taking place. So how does care happen there? So I don't know how to formulate the question well, but goes in this line, how to give care on a moment where the person who cares for doesn't want to engage with it. I don't know if I'm clear now. Thank you.
Well, it might be a very, very experienced carer who knows exactly what to do, who knows exactly how to read the signs of the person who needs the care, and who's doing it out of their duty to care. They don't necessarily put that much of themselves in it. But I think in general, care is very difficult to do well, to do in the sense of really meeting the need, when there isn't a level of engagement, some level of engagement. Even some very rudimentary things like, fixing a pillow isn't just fixing a pillow. It's fixing a pillow the way the person who needs the pillow will benefit from the placement of the pillow. I mean, I have seen caregiving going on where people are just very competent at doing certain kinds of things. And to that extent, the caring reaches its mark. The again, the point of my shifting from the intentions of the caregiver, not that intentions are totally unimportant, to the reception of care, is that if the person being cared for really does meet their needs in the way in which they can appreciate that their needs have been filled, then you can call it care. Unless somebody's doing it for benevolent reasons. But the point, my point is really, let's look first at what gets accomplished. How does it get accomplished? Does it get accomplished? And then secondarily looking at, what is that person's motivations and how do they manage to achieve care when it's achieved. And of course, there's tons of bad care going on all the time. We've all experienced it from intimates and from caregivers, from hospitals, everywhere. But so that kind of care goes on all the time.
So, Eva, we have at least 3 or 4 more questions. Are you tiring? Would you like to do a couple more questions?
You want to give a bunch of questions together? So, because I see it's already 2:30. Oh, 2:30. Right, it's 1:30 in your. Right. Okay. We're not over. No, I'm fine.
Okay, good. Okay, then Pip Bennett.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm just thinking about the in chapter 8, the completion of care requirement, and I'm a bit troubled by the connection between the plant thought experiment and then the idea of the completion of care between subjects. So, in the plant thought experiment, I agree that there is. It's a reasonable intuition that one hasn't in fact cared for the plant if you poured white vinegar on it or spirit vinegar on it. You've definitely killed it, no matter what you were trying to do. However, I don't see that that intuition legitimately following through to subjects, but for the reason that you give as a qualification a bit later in that chapter. You talk about Sue caring for her sister Anne, and if we change Sue caring for her sister Anne, not that she actually harmed her, but she had the right intention, she was meeting an expressed need, but she misfired a bit. We all get things wrong. It's not quite right. And you suggest, and this is I think really important, that we can recognize as the one being cared for the sincere effort of the one caring. I'm sorry, I'm using Noddings' nomenclature. And that can be a very, very positive experience where we feel seen, maybe not seen as much as we'd like, but we feel seen. And when you were giving the presentation at the beginning, you said that we have an intuitive sense that something positive should happen for the one cared for. And so to me, that either Sue, in my slightly adjusted example, has in fact cared normatively, so uppercase care for Anne, or there is a problem with requiring completion in that sense. I just wondered whether I've missed the point, or whether there's anything to, because she's a subject. If we're talking about subjects, we're not talking about plants.
Right.
There's just these added scopes for the interrelation.
Yes, well, because we're talking about subjects, we have to be able to take the subject's point of view. We can't really take the plant's point of view. But yes, I think there is a lot of value in feeling that a person is trying to care for you. And sometimes that's just adequate, okay, my pillow's not so great, but I know she really meant to take care of me, and I really appreciate that. And that becomes the more important end of the care. So that, you know, the need that was first called out becomes subordinate to this broader sense of appreciating the attempt of the other, not just the attempt, but the sense of being cared for by the other. The other really wants to care for you, you know. So I think there's a completion there. It's not quite the completion of the need that was originally addressed, but there is a certain kind of completion there. There is a certain meeting of an important need. And often when we're in a situation where, you know, we're not well, or whatever the case may be, but where we really do need care, sometimes there's just a lot of comfort to be had in feeling cared for, whether or not all your needs are met. And sometimes there's no, you know, this is sort of the reverse side of Marco, was it? Marco's question, you know. So there may be concrete needs that can be met without feeling cared for. And if feeling cared for is an important part of that, then there's a real incompleteness there. And I would say the same in this case. You know, there's a certain amount of completion, you know, in that part of the need is satisfied, but some more mundane parts of the need may not be, or they may not be mundane. I mean, they may be actually quite significant. I mean, could even be life affecting. Does that help?
Good. Sarah Lucas.
Sorry. Hi, Eva. Thank you so much. Hi. This is an old question. You'd be like, not this again. But it's one that I've been coming back to myself a lot lately about agency. And it seems to me that, or the thing that I like most about the kind normative payoff of the completion of care is that it really brings into, I think, sharp relief that agency always is relational and always has a sort of aspect of both giving and receiving. And I just think that is so beautiful and so beautifully sort of wrought in this chapter, especially. But you have this thing that you say on page 186, where you say, the general assumption is that to be a recipient is to be passive, to resist is instead a mark of agency, but this is false. To be receptive to care can itself be an active affirmation of a willingness to be helped, and so on. So I'm just wondering what we say to how we build a bridge between this understanding of agency and the understanding of agency in feminist political theory, especially sort of radical feminist political theory, where resistance is really the only way that we can understand agency. And I think so, like, I'm thinking, like, how do we convince a Kathy Weeks or a Linda Zerilli or a Lois McNay that this way of understanding agency as receptivity even is something that needs to supplement sort of more, also very important, political and radical accounts of agency as resisting power. That's it, basically.
Well, I think these things are relative to the situation. I mean, we're in an oppressive, if you're in the position of a person who's being oppressed, then being receptive to your treatment is not a is not a form of agency. So it's not, I mean, that's not an absolute. That's a point that's relative to a situation. So when you're in a situation where you need help and you resist it because you want to show that you can do it yourself, even though you can't. That's where it's a kind of misplaced agency to resist. So that's, I think, all I want to say. I don't want to say that acceptance of another's actions is simply always a form of action. I mean, sometimes it is, often it isn't. But my point is only that sometimes it is. Is that satisfactory?
Yeah, I guess what's just been bugging me lately is that I feel like there needs to be a bridge built between critical feminist theory and care ethics in a way that it's not yet been built. And there's sort of a dismissiveness in critical feminism of care ethics that I think is really misguided and misplaced. And so I wonder if one way to get at the problem is to think about what political agency looks like in a sort of normative care ethics, which is maybe what I was really trying to ask. Sorry.
I think I addressed some of these points actually in the previous chapter, where I tried to talk about the argument against care ethics, that it's a slave morality. I mean, I don't talk specifically about the question of agency, but I think that point may be lying behind some of the idea that to do anything but resist is not being an agent. And I mean, even in oppressive situations, well, this is a can of worms.
Sorry.
I think even in oppressive situations, there may be a time when not resisting is a form of agency too. But
I'll email you.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay, next up, Chloe Atkins.
Thank you. Thank you both, Eva and Amber. You've given me a lot to think about. And I forgive me, I haven't read the book. I've only read the chapter, so I'm responding what's been said here. As someone who's received a lot of care, I have an episodic disability that renders me really vulnerable. I will confirm what Judy Heumann says, is that it is this very exhausting process in which I do sort of arrange lexically my needs all the time to try to make it easier for somebody else. Therefore, it makes it easier on me, the pressure. So there is this ongoing, it is a relationship. And so I do like the notion of grace, but I think it sort of needs to be worked out. I'm not sure you can fully work it out, because there is always this feeling of that I should just be grateful, given all that's wrong with me, that I have a place in the world, that I've managed to get this spot in the world. And that's not because people are being ungenerous. It's because systemically we have so many issues that just don't allow people to go forward. And I think I'm just confirming in a sense what you've said and what Jenny Nadalski is sort of working on, which is I think that the care is really part of the social structures which surround us. And I'm doing work on disability and employment, and I'm interviewing people who have, profound disabilities, physical and sensory ones, because who've succeeded in the workplace. And they're phenomenal individuals. First of all, they're very persistent and they're remarkably intelligent. I mean, I'd want any of them in my workplace. But the key that I notice is that they've all managed to secure, in a sense, a caring environment, which is they have access to affordable housing and accessible housing and PSWs and or transportation and a financial stability from which they can launch and fail and not lose these things. And so I think in order for you, for the paradigm which you're taking, we need to more generally see care as something that is not just interactional on a one-on-one basis, but as one which just around which our whole society is based, right? I mean, it is, I've been thinking about rethinking around disability, which is, it's always, you know, if we hadn't invented eyeglasses, we'd have far more disabled people in the world who require lots of assistance, but we have, it's become ubiquitous, that technology, so it's no longer an issue. And, you know, we never would have thought a blind person could drive a car, but soon we are going to have autopiloted cars, and maybe in fact you will have blind people who own cars in the future, unimaginable 100 years ago. So you know that things sort of change, but it's that caring, it's the infrastructure that we also have to see as caring, and not that it's not so, it is personal. Yes, there's grace, but it is so much easier, and it won't be so expensive interpersonally if in fact we advocate for these other structures that support, and then they support everybody. And then I'm sorry, you were said at the end that we, you know, maybe we need to all think of ourselves as dependent. I kind of like the notion of vulnerability, that if we all think of ourselves as vulnerable, that maybe we, I don't know, I wonder what you think about all that and how that works. There, I offer it to you. That's all I'm going to say.
No, Chloe, I entirely agree with you that the intimate, caring relationship is always embedded in larger structures, and the ability of someone to be able to care is often dependent on these nested structures. So structures, social structures that create a more caring base for people to live within, make, then, the special needs become much less special. They just become needs among other needs, right?
Less heavy, right? They're not individualized. They're sort of generalized, right?
Right. And here, pulling in the social model of disability is very important too. So I mean, maybe this is one way care ethics can work together with disability, critical disability studies. That a social model would require a more a society that is more accustomed to the variety of human needs and the variety of human experiences. So I entirely agree with you. And really, I think you can count a lot of failures of care have to do with the fact that there isn't the outer support to that particular caring relationship. I had a thought as you were talking, though, about gratitude and graciousness, which is that if you think you don't, that if you think you're imposing on people because of your needs, then you're going to feel like you need to be grateful. And I'm sure that gratefulness begins to feel very exhausting. It's very complicated with parents and any of these thick familial relationships.
But it's also there with paid relationships, that you do not want to piss people off who have power over you, and so you lure them to like you. You make sure that they like you, so that in all of these labors that they don't harm you. Right? That's part of the exhaustion.
Right. These sorts of dynamics are something that I discuss a lot in the chapter on dependency. So why do I want to talk about dependency and talk, I'm going to talk about vulnerability, of course, I sometimes want to insist on the term dependent because it brings in the fact that we are relational creatures. I mean, we can be vulnerable in our solitude, you know. Vulnerability doesn't bring in that notion of relationship. Dependency is, it's a very fraught term. I wish there were a better one. But it's that kind of needing to rely on one another. And there are booby traps everywhere. There are booby traps everywhere. And they enter into caring relations in a most unfortunate way. Right. And how do we begin to deal with that? And one answer that you're suggesting, at least to begin to deal with it, is to work on the social structures. And I'm entirely with you on that, and that's the next volume.
One of the things I'll just add quickly, just for you to think about on the next one, is around COVID, and I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been in this situation, is you talk about the reciprocity of care. If you're working on an unconscious patient in ICU who cannot respond and your obligations around care, so you kind of, there's a sort of like the universal theory in physics, you kind of want a universal theory as you're approaching this in care for that individual, that relationship as well. Anyway, I'll be quiet now.
Yeah. Well, I do go through sort of various, starting from the plant, the vegetative that, can't respond to you directly, to the unconscious patient. There's a body there that responds or doesn't respond. And also, in some cases, that there's a will that's been expressed. So you're also taking that into account. But where you simply have an unconscious body and you have no idea, then the best you can do is just treat the body and do the best by the body. Yeah. So it depends on what kind of being you are taking care of, or what condition of being is.
Okay, so we have just 5 minutes left. We have some comments. Sarah Goring, I don't know if you want to, ask this question.
Sure, I can be really quick. Thank you so much. I just think maybe my question is the other side of Lisa Tessman's, where, and you've already spoken to, people can be trying to care, and it, even if they're not successful, it seems like we want some awareness of the moral value of that. But on the other side, I thought it can be really difficult to know when you have been cared for well, and that even in a regular day-to-day thing, I know there are people who are trying to care for me and they sometimes frustrate me. And then I might say in that moment, I don't take that to be completed care or successful care, but maybe down the line, I change my mind about it. And I think you talk in the book, and now it's been a little bit since I read that chapter, about the kind of long-term effect, but I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what I think of as kind of a dance of trying to figure out for people around you, if you're doing the right thing and if they are doing the thing that you need. I think I just often don't know.
Yeah, it is. I think the the metaphor of dance is the metaphor to use. So in a dance, you try to feel your way to the partner's movement. You do it more or less well. You don't do it very well if you're thinking about something else, or if you really don't want to be in the dance in the first place. You might feel your way too much to the other person, such that the person loses their own feeling about dancing with you. But it is very much a dance, and it's the way in which you receive care that has been given to you, and the way in which you think about it over time really can change. So things that you thought were very caring, you see, were very misguided. No. And were not good care at all. In my own case, my parents were so careful with me and wanted me to be so careful all the time, I turned into somebody who's frightened of everything. So I don't think they did me a big favor there. Usually we think about it the other way, that you think of it, you don't think it's care at the time, but you come to appreciate that it's care later. But it works the other way around too. And often, the motives involved, which might reveal themselves at a later point, will make you reinterpret the whole action as not caring, because motives and intentions are still part of it. They're just not the be all and end all of it. So I'm not sure I have any more to say on that.
So there are a couple more questions, or there's a couple more comments in there, and then question. Annie Bartos has a question, but I think Eva, maybe we should give you a break. You weren't feeling well. You've been an incredible trooper. I
feel fine now. The adrenaline of
Yeah, but I mean, this has been a great conversation. It's given me so much to think about. I'm going to email you. I've got some questions too, so I hope that's okay.
And email me. Feel free to email me if you have questions and you want to talk about it furthermore.
Good. Yeah, great. Thank you. But yeah, I think we should probably wrap things up to let everyone get on their way. But this has been great. It's been such a nice little break out of my summer of usually just sitting in front of my computer typing, and to actually to be engaged in this kind of conversation and event. So thank you, Eva. Thank you, Amber. Thank you for everyone who came and your questions and just for being here. It was a really wonderful time for me, and I hope it was for you. And we will be back on September 15th with Ilana Bush. Am I saying your last name right, Ilana?
It's Bush.
Bush. Okay.
Yep.
Ilana Bush. So that'll be a Wednesday, and then we'll do a few of these in the fall and see how it goes. So I hope to see you all then. Have a great rest of your summer, and we'll be seeing you in the fall.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Eva.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. That's great.
No.
Thanks so much, Eva.
Yeah. Thanks, Amber.
Thank you, Amber, and thank you for your comments. They're very, very valuable, and things that I need to consider more.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. We'll see you.
Okay.
Bye.